happen to have a book to recommend to you to go and get, like we said, Elliot's book is just a wonderful, wonderful book, Green on Blue. I should say for thousands of years, novels have explored an exhausting variety of approaches to describing war and its effect on men and women in uniform, and even those folks that are living between different colors of uniform. And my own preference has always been for that simple, personal look at conflict that allows for empathy without obsession, understanding without preaching. Similar to Vonnegut, Heller, those kinds of authors, other authors who form their military experiences, their own military experiences, into storytelling, and allow us to see war from the inside and from a very, very personal perspective. Green on Blue gives us a new look at this pull of armed conflict and its absorption of the people trapped inside decades of war. The combination of money, status, camaraderie, and desperation resulting in a certain skill set that relies on a constant supply of conflict. It's just an absolutely wonderful book. Mr. Ackerman's actions during 5 tours of duty, both Iraq and Afghanistan, were recognized with the Silver Star, Bronze Star for Valor, as well as the Purple Heart. A recent White House fellow, his outstanding fiction and essays have appeared in the New Yorker in particular, the Atlantic, New Republic, Daily Beast, and many, many more. He's a master's degree in international affairs. He's a brilliant Marine Corps officer, a writer. He's currently visiting from his home in Istanbul, where he's reporting on the ever-changing situations in Syria and Iraq and the borders of Turkey. You undoubtedly have seen his dozens of interviews, dozens easily. The Daily Show to Charlie Rose. We are extremely excited to have him here today, and please help me welcome Elliot Ackerman.
Thank you. Thanks. That was a very generous introduction. So I thought I'd just read a little bit from the opening of the book. This is from the very beginning. Many would call me a dishonest man, but I've always kept faith with myself. There is an honesty in that, I think. I am Ali's brother. We are from a village that no longer exists, and our family was not large or prosperous. The war that came after the Russians, but before the Americans, killed our parents. Of them, I have only dim memories. There is my father's Kalashnikov, hidden in a woodpile by the door, him cleaning it, working oiled rags on its parts, and the smell of gunmetal, and feeling safe. There is my mother's secret, the one she shared with me. Once a month, she'd count out my father's earnings from fighting in the mountains or farming. She'd send me and Ali from our village, Sperkai, to the large bazaar in Orgun, a 2-day walk. The Orgun bazaar sold everything: fine cooking oils and spices, candles to light our home, and fabrics to repair our clothes. My mother always entrusted me with a special purchase. Before we left, she would press an extra coin in my hand, one she'd stolen from my father. Among the crowded stalls of the bazaar, I would slip away from my brother's watchful eye and buy her a pack of cigarettes, a vice forbidden to a woman. When we returned home, I would place the pack on her hiding spot, the birchwood cradle where she'd rocked Ali and me as infants. Our mud-walled house was small, 2 thatch-roof rooms with a courtyard between them. The cradle was kept in the room I shared with Ali. My mother would never get rid of the cradle. It was the one thing that was truly hers. At night, after we returned from the bazaar, she'd sneak into our room, her small, sandaled feet gliding across the carpets that lined the dirt floor. Her hand would cup a candle, its smothered light casting shadows on her young face, aging her. Her eyes, one brown and the other green, a miracle or defect of birth, shifted about the room. Carefully, she would lean over the cradle as she'd done before taking us to nurse. She would run her fingers between the blankets that once swaddled my brother and me. And, finding the pack I'd left her, she'd step into the courtyard, and I'd fall back asleep to the faint smell of her tobacco just past my door. This secret made me feel close to my mother. In the years since, I've wondered why she entrusted me with it. At times, I've thought it was because I was her favorite, but this isn't why. The truth is, she recognized in me her own ability to deceive. So that's the very opening of the book. And it's the voice of Aziz, who's the protagonist of the novel. And Aziz is basically, in that passage, he's remembering when he was a young boy being raised by his parents. It's sort of difficult to know, I think, frequently with a novel as you're setting out to write it, where the story is really beginning from. Your beginning becomes your middle becomes your ending, and your ending becomes your beginning. And for me, I think, as Matt might have alluded to, I served in the Marines for 8 years, and I did 4 tours in Afghanistan. But all the time I spent in Afghanistan was strictly as an advisor to Afghan troops. So my war buddies weren't exclusively a bunch of Americans like we typically think of. They were the Afghan soldiers I advised over there. And so when I came back, these weren't a bunch of guys who I could, keep up with on Facebook, call long distance, or go get 50-cent beers with at the local VFW. They were trapped in Afghanistan in that country's elliptical civil war, and when I left the service, I knew that I would never see them again. So, the ambition of the book in many ways, and what you hear with Aziz's voice, is sort of this attempt, my groping attempt, to try to render the war not from the American perspective, but from the perspective of the Afghans that I came to know. And, when I reflected, why did I have this impulse to write a novel from the Afghan perspective, for me it was really kind of this act of reckoning. It was reckoning with the loss of those relationships in my life. And so in many ways, for me, the novel is sort of a last act of friendship on the behalf of my war buddies, many of whom were Afghans. But as I mentioned with a novel, you sort of, you obviously, you never really know where you're going with this story, but frequently you kind of have these guideposts. And what's funny is, as I've been on the road with the book, as I mentioned, it is all the story of this Afghan soldier. It is all told in his voice, but people will often ask me, hey, Elliot, is the book, how much of this is autobiographical? And I'll sort of laugh and say, it's an Afghan. I mean, clearly none of this is autobiographical. But, it's caused me to think, about what role that plays in my fiction and my writing. And, if I were to be honest, I would say, a friend of mine actually said, Elliot, you sort of wrote, your Afghan alter ego wrote a memoir. I thought that was sort of true. But, but I think with any fiction, for me in particular, because I write nonfiction as well, with my fiction, if you can imagine, it's like I'm standing in a field, right? And it's this field of sort of high, dry grass. And I'm trying to light that field on fire with a story, to make that metaphor. And what I've got in my hand are sort of they're 2 flints. And I'm banging those flints together as hard as I can to create sparks, to cast this whole field on fire. And so for me, those 2 flints are always some real experience I've had. There's something in my memory, something I'm wrestling with. And then the fire is sort of all imagination. So to sort of extend that, I would like to share with you guys just an anecdote that for me was really one of those 2 flints the whole time I was writing this book. The story of a young Afghan who goes off to fight, who gets sucked into the war, who's exposed to militia commanders, Taliban fighters, and starts to realize he's fighting a war for every reason but the ending of it. And so when I was an advisor, one of the guys who was one of my contemporaries was a fellow named Commander Isak. So if you can imagine, I worked with Isak in 2011. And we were in southeastern Afghanistan in Paktika province, which is one of the most violent provinces. And our fire base was about 5 kilometers from the Pakistani border, sort of in this tall tabletop of high desert. And that fire base was about 3 football fields in diameter, dusty, remote. And there was really just sort of a constellation of wooden plywood shacks. And so Isak lived in one shack on his side of the fire base, and I lived on one kind of right across the way. And every 2 weeks, we would have what was very grandly called our operational planning meeting. So what that really involved was me at about 10 in the morning, lacing my boots up, walking over to Isak's little plywood hooch, knocking on the door, saying, hey, Isak, time for the operational planning meeting. And I would walk into his little hooch, very Spartan conditions, and he had a sofa, small, I guess it was a 2-person sofa, so I guess you'd call it a love seat. So I would sit on the love seat with Isak, the 2 of us next to each other, and he had a little coffee table in front of him made out of plywood, and he would go down, he'd pour out a pot of chai for us, get down his pack of cigarettes, and we'd sit there leaning back on the love seat, hot, dusty, summer southeastern Afghanistan, and we would stare at the far wall. And hanging on the far wall were two things. It's a map and a calendar. So I'd say, all right, ESOC operational planning meeting, what are we going to do for the next couple of weeks? And he'd go up there, smoking his cigarette. He'd look at the map, and he'd point to, one of the villages near where we were, right on the Pakistani border, and he'd say, Mr. Elliot, he's like, we could run a patrol up to Mangrate. There's always very good hunting in Mangrate. So a lot of Taliban in Mangrate. I'd say, all right, ESOC, that sounds pretty good. I'd go to the calendar. I'd blot off, maybe 8 days for that patrol. We'd load up the troops in about 10 trucks, 70 to 100 guys, and we'd patrol up to Mangrate. And there'd be a 50-50 odds we'd get in some type of gunfight up in Mangrate. We would come back down to our fire base. We'd give the guys a day or two to do maintenance on the truck, change tires, things like that, give them a day off. And then inevitably it would be time for the operational planning meeting. And I'd lace up my boots, I'd walk across the fire base, knock on the door, and I'd come back, flop down in the love seat. All right, ESOC, time for the meeting. And he'd go over, same thing, pot of chai, pack of smokes, map, calendar. Say, ESOC, that was a great patrol. We ran up to Mangrate, good operation. What do you think we should do for the next couple of weeks? And, he'd worked this ground for 10 years. He'd been the commander there, so he knew it better than anybody. And he'd come to the map again, smoking his cigarette, and he'd probably look at the next village south and go, Mr. Elliot, we could go to Malakshey. Always very good hunting in Malakshey. I'd say, all right, let's do Malakshey. We'd block out the time again, and we get the troops in the trucks, and we go launch another patrol. And that was sort of what our war was like. And never in that time was the conversation, Mr. Elliot, if we run an operation up in Mangrate, then we hit them down in Malakshey. We could run one last patrol into the village south, Rawakare, and we could shut the border to Pakistan. The Taliban couldn't come in here anymore. The war would be over. I can go back to my crops. You can go back to the U.S., get your Master of Fine Arts, write that novel you're always talking about. Like, that just wasn't the conversation that we were having. It wasn't, we weren't engaged in these conflicts I think we as Americans frequently think of, where with the General Eisenhowers and their declarations of war and their peace treaties. The war we were involved in, it just was not that type of war. So what type of war was it? And in writing this book, as much as it's the story of Aziz, in many ways, it's an effort to try to render the Afghan war a microcosm and to try to get at some of the truths of that war, which I think, at least when I left to go fight it, were not intuitive. It was very much a war that was being fought for every single reason but the ending of the war. So with that, I'd like to read just another section of the book that gets into that theme a little bit. So as I mentioned, the protagonist of the book is this young Afghan named Aziz, and as we met him in the earlier passage, it was this time between the Soviet occupation and the American invasion, really when the Taliban were in ascent. And right after that passage, what you see is both of his parents are killed, and his older brother Ali takes him to a village, really a small city called Orgun, where they eke out a living as delivery boys. And after a couple of years, Ali is horribly maimed in a bombing in a bazaar. And the deal that Aziz basically strikes is that he will go fight in a militia, and his wages from fighting will keep his brother cared for in the hospital. So he goes off to fight, and as he goes to fight, he gets sucked into this elliptical war that's sort of, as I mentioned, being fought for a whole host of reasons. And one of the things that they're trying to do is the militia he's fighting with is trying to build an outpost in this one village. And many of the villagers there are against it. So Aziz gets sent down there to act as an informant to find out what some of these elders and why some of these villagers don't want the outpost built. And as he serves as an informant, he goes to live with a man named Mumtaz. And Mumtaz is an old Mujahideen fighter from the war against the Soviets. And this is Mumtaz's story as told to Aziz. So, when my brother died, he said, it was not in the war we thought we fought. We were Mujahideen and treated as heroes in this village. Our battlefield achievements known by all, earning us honor. Honor we became greedy for. This led to larger and more daring attacks. When the fighting slowed each winter, we'd grow impatient for it. The Russians stayed on their bases, and it was difficult to strike at them. An informant of ours in Orgun, a man who, like our father, ran a trucking company, told us how in a few nights a Russian convoy would pass our village along the North Road. Eager as we were, My brother and I asked few questions. The operation would be simple. After curfew, we'd bury a mine in the road, and in the morning, if the Russians didn't show up, we'd remove it. Some days later, in the darkness, my brother and I chipped a ditch out of the frozen earth and slid the mine in. We carefully repacked the crumbled soil and went home, giving the matter little thought, as if we'd planted a tree and casually wondered if it'd grow. We slept soundly, and early the following morning, before the sun rose, we returned to either inspect our kill or to recover the mine. As we walked through the clear, cold air, the snow on the distant hilltops glowed with firelight. The mine had struck, and we approached the road riding on great gusts of enthusiasm. But still our situation was uncertain. Who knew if the Russians had sent anyone to aid their convoy? Who knew if we'd come across any manic survivors? These were uncertainties we felt prepared for. We weren't prepared for what we found. As we crested a last ridge and glimpsed our kill, we saw only the beginning of our terrible mistake. Tilted against its side as if the carcass of a great steel beast was the truck, but it wasn't Russian. It was civilian and full of lumber that now burned in a pyre, sparkling on the snow. We kept our distance, but were close enough to feel the fire on our faces. We could see the cab and its white paint, which curled to scales against the heat, and then the steel beneath the paint that scorched to rust. Behind a shattered windshield, flames licked out an upright silhouette that burned with the dignity of one who met death immediately, without pain and shock, and through this absence seemed strangely alive. I can't say how long we watched the pyre. When we left, the sun still hadn't risen, but the silhouette had been consumed. On our journey home, we said nothing and tried to hide in our silence. News of the attack spread through all the families of Gomal. The truck had been from our informant's company, and the dead driver had been his employee. Several days later, my father and our village's Spengaris were called to a jirga in Orgun to settle the matter. The deliberations were short, lasting but 2 days, and my father returned in ruin. The Spengaris on both sides decreed that our father was responsible for our actions, and that he must replace the destroyed truck and buy yet another to recoup the damaged cargo. In this, our informant made out very well, for the first truck forced us to sell our home, and the second wiped out my father's accounts, eliminating him as a business competitor. And that's when we moved here. So, in that section, what we see is that Mumtaz is a young Mujahideen fighter, thinks he's fighting against the Soviets, but really winds up getting duped by one of his father's business competitors. And, this sort of gets at a theme throughout the book is that, there are economies in war. And what I mean by economies are not necessarily financial economies, although that can often be part of it, but it's something that, although it isn't intuitive, it's actually a little bit obvious. To go back to my friend Commander Isak, before the war and the decade he spent fighting in that remote part of Afghanistan, he was a farmer. And then when the war started, he showed a real aptitude for being a soldier, and he wound up leading a very influential militia group. The war had elevated him. And in many cases, with any war that's being fought, the participants in the war are often elevated by the war. And outside of a very functional and stable democracy, when war elevates people, those people are no longer incented to see the war end. The conclusion of the war basically would mark their devaluation, them losing their status in society. And so as we sit here 14 years into a war in Afghanistan and wonder when will it end, some of those economies, they factor mightily in the perpetual nature of these wars, not only in Afghanistan, in many other conflicts. To change gears for just a second, the book is all written, again, from the perspective of the Afghan, but obviously I am not Afghan. So that was actually a bit of a journey to get to that decision. The book was originally written with Aziz telling his story to an American interlocutor, a character who was essential in early drafts of the novel, but who never made it into the end. And it was basically Aziz, the original drafts of the book, Aziz opens and he's telling his story to this American. It was sort of like kind of a Conradian construct, almost like The Heart of Darkness, where Marlowe is telling his story of going up the river to see Kurtz on this boat in the Thames. But as I was writing the novel, that frame really wasn't holding up, I realized. that I had stuck this American character in there and he felt two-dimensional. And I sort of had to start asking myself some questions. Is, all right, Elliot, why did you do that? You know, what function is this American character playing? And as I was honest with myself, I realized that in the early drafts of the book, I needed this American to act as a filter, to give me kind of an excuse to inhabit Aziz's voice. And so a little bit later, I made the decision to remove this American entirely once I got comfortable with Aziz's voice and kind of go all in that the book was going to be told completely from the Afghan perspective. But frankly, that was a little bit frightening because it meant the book would succeed or fail based solely on the merits of Aziz's voice. And that being said, I'd like to just leave with one kind of last idea. Something else that surprised me is as the book's been out is, frequently the question will come up, well, Elliot, why write in fiction? You could have written a memoir. First, obviously, I said, well, you don't ask a painter why he doesn't take photographs. He's a painter. But it's caused me to think about, what is the role in fiction? And something that always struck me when I was serving in Afghanistan, and in fact, it made Afghanistan very different than Iraq, for instance. In Iraq, when I was serving in Iraq, the Iraqis very much, even though they lived under Saddam for such a long time, they viewed the war as an aberration. It was not the usual state of affairs, and they wanted the war to end. In Afghanistan, the Afghans were very, very used to war. 35 years of it since 1979 when the Soviets invaded. And it got me to thinking this idea of, why write in fiction and how long the war had been going on in Afghanistan. The average life expectancy of an Afghan male is 60 years old, just a little older than 60. So if you go back, that means your average Afghan male who's dying off today was 24 years old in 1979. So in about 10 more years, or even 5 more years, you're really not going to have very many Afghans left who have adult memories of their country at peace. So when you have nobody left who can remember peace, conjuring peace no longer becomes an act of returning to something. It becomes an act of sheer imagination. And so I think there's a real role for storytelling in that regard. And with that, I'd just like to read one last passage, and maybe we can open it up to some conversation and questions. So this is when Aziz goes to visit Mumtaz, the character I mentioned before. These are some of his observations when he first comes into Gomal, which is the village that Mumtaz lives in. So the night was cold, and all through it I got up, stepped lightly over Mumtaz, and fed dried branches into the mouth of the stove. Once the last scrap burned out in the fire, a chill set into my legs and woke me. I walked into the compound's dirt courtyard to wait for the dawn. As the early light came, I saw how poor Mumtaz was. His home was nothing more than the small coop, the mud room we slept in, and the 4 walls of the courtyard. A ditch ran beneath one of the walls and out the back. Dishes were stacked alongside it. This was the kitchen. Past Mumtaz's compound were the mountains. Though it seemed these never ended, they were not enough to protect the village from the war, but they were enough to preserve it and its traditions. And, even as isolated as the village was, sprouts of progress had arrived. Motorbikes, cell phones, and a few homemade satellite dishes that perched from rooftops, all standing as messengers from other, more modern worlds. But it was a false progress. It measured not movement forward, but the distance we would soon travel backward when the war destroyed everything. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? I'm sure. Fictional reality?
I think which is why make reality fiction. I think there's a truth that you can only get at in fiction. In many respects, people remember story. Fiction conveys, I think, the art of storytelling in a way that you can't necessarily always get at in nonfiction. I think, the point of any art is to basically transfer emotion from one person to another. And I think that if you can do that in a story and you can make somebody feel something, they will remember that story and it will stick with them. So if I can conjure up a reality of Afghanistan, as I mentioned, the ambition of the book was to try to tell the war in micro, but to do it in a way that might make you feel something, something that you would remember, then maybe that will make the war real for you in a way that a book of nonfiction that categorizes the war, the various tribes and sub-tribes and dates of the Afghan war, which are all real and important things, but might not have the same amount of emotional resonance. So for me, the reason to render the story in fiction and to make that, to fictionalize that reality, although this is not an autobiographical book, is because my hope is that it will elicit greater emotion and resonance with the reader. Um,
Pardon me one second. We have an emergency announcement to read.
sure.
We apologize. I need to borrow your microphone real quickly. Apparently, there is an emergency warning announcement that lightning has been reported in the area, and everyone's to take shelter in the parking garage across from Summit Street near the subway, in City Hall, or any one of our event buses or vehicles, or as well under the tent. This festival will resume once the weather conditions have improved and it's safe to do so. So it's about 15 or 20 minutes away, so we have room for like 2 more questions. If not, we're kind of in a gully here, so we might want to make it a little brief. But nevertheless, I've enjoyed listening to your novel. So back to you with Q&A.
Sure. I just want to ask her, and I'll answer that, and then we can all get struck by lightning. Listen, I think that there are a lot of books that are going to be written about the Afghan War. There have been a lot of books that are written about the Afghan War. I felt like I wanted to write this novel in fiction. I had no desire to write a memoir because I am a novelist. So again, it's sort of don't ask a painter to take photographs. I wanted to tell a story, so that's why I wrote. Yeah. And then, yes, the next book I'm working on, I believe that was your question, is it's actually set on the Turkish-Syrian border. I've been traveling down there for about the last year and a half, going on 2 years, and it's a love story set on the Turkish-Syrian border. 2011. I always knew I would. I'm the son of a novelist. I studied history and literature at school, but I knew I would write when I was in the service. I had 1 or 2 false starts. I couldn't get started while the experiences were so close, and I actually started penning. It's not this book, but it was actually a short story. It was the day after I decided I was going to resign. I was in Afghanistan. I sent my resignation letter in, and something just got knocked loose once I knew it was done for me that allowed me to kind of start reckoning with some of these experiences in my fiction. Yeah.
And Elliot, you promised that new book's coming relatively soon, right?
Yeah, it will be. So, well, thank you all. Be safe.